Hello, this is Professor Joseph Holbrook in Latin American, teaching Latin American civilizations, and we are now in Chapter 5 of Martin and Wasserman's book, Latin American Peoples, and Chapter 5 deals with the changing world of the Amerindians after the arrival and conquest of the Europeans. So let us begin. Spaniards dominated the Indian empires and tended to cluster in certain areas of the New World where there were a large concentration of Native Americans with centralized empires. The two examples of this would be New Spain, which was the name for modern Mexico, around the former Aztec Empire, around the capital of Tenochtitlan, and the other one would be in South America in the Peruvian Andes, where the concentration of the Incan Empire was. They did this for very logical reasons, to find and utilize mineral and agricultural resources, also labor supply. The abundant native population created a cheap source of surplus labor. As a result, the highland peoples of Mexico and Peru experienced more Spanish intrusions and repression than marginal areas, such as perhaps the Yucatan Peninsula or the Amazon Basin in South America. The Spanish attempted to create two legal systems. This was partly because of the influence of Bartolomé de las Casas on the Spanish monarchy. So the Spanish monarchy attempted to create a legal system that would protect the Native Americans from depredations of the Spaniards. And so they called the legal system for the Native Americans the República de los Indios, to protect the scattered Indian villages. The Spaniards were under the República de los Españoles. This prevented European outsiders, other than priests or minor officials such as alcaldes or corregidores, from living in the República de los Indios. They were technically not allowed to enter into Indian territories. But the populations began to rapidly change and shift. In the República de Indios, the demographic makeup began changing, partly because of the massive decline in population due to influenza, measles, smallpox. Over the next 80 to 100 years, nearly 90% of the Native American population died off. Also because of overwork and labor conditions and Spanish brutality, although the great majority was due to disease and illness. There were growing numbers of mestizos. Mestizos were those individuals born of the union of Spaniards with Native Americans. And there were also a growing number of people who were also born of the union of Spaniards and Africans and Indians and Africans. And so you had a number of mixed blood peoples growing both in the República de Indios as well as the República de Españoles. Native people did not always comply with forced resettlements. They often resisted. In the local government of the República de Indios, you had a gobernador who was appointed by the Spanish, and regidores and alcaldes. These were normally in the hands of Native Americans, often the former nobility of the Incan or the Aztec social hierarchy. Cabildos were the town councils. There were also some Spanish magistrates that were allowed to live in the villages of the República de Indios. They were known as corregidores and alcaldes mayores. You could tell that the alcaldes mayores, who they were in distinction from alcaldes, because the alcaldes mayores were mayor. That was a joke in Spanish. This implied some degree of native complicity with the Spanish power structure. Those Native Americans at the higher levels of the former social hierarchy of the empires, in other words, the Indian nobility, often were giving special privileges and given positions of power and influence in the new social structure, and so they went along with the Spanish power structure because of the personal benefit to them. The form of agriculture for a time was subsistence and survival. Nevertheless, the large Spanish haciendas and ranchos began to encroach on Indian land. Much of the Indian land was held in common. They tended to think collectively rather in terms of private property. There were also courts that they could go to for relief from excessive demands for tribute or forced labor, obligations, or abuses. There was often sympathy in the court system for the Indians because of the residual influence of Bartolomé de las Casas and the Black Legend. Occasionally, the República de Indios would resort to violence in order to protest abuses or resist Spanish oppression. Gradually, they were drawn into a cash economy through the sale of their agricultural produce and craft and artisanal items. They were able to earn wages. They also earned wages, the Native Americans, that is, laboring in mines and on haciendas during the harvest periods. So they formed a sort of floating labor supply and were able to generate some cash. This was useful when it came to the reparto de las mercancías. The reparto de mercancías was a system of credit and supply of tools, seed, all the necessary things for farming that came through the Spanish government. It was basically a complete monopoly. And the corregidores and alcaldes mayores, who were the Spanish officials in local villages, were the only authorized representatives who were allowed to sell these commodities to the natives. And they were allowed to do it on credit. So the natives were drawn into the larger cash and global economy through the reparto de mercancías. The cash economy was also a global economy. For the first time, Native Americans were now entering into the world economic system that they had not been part of before the arrival of Spaniards and Portuguese in the New World. One of the dominant exports that was highly in demand in Europe was cochineal. It was a red dye that was extracted from insects that lived on cacti native to the region of Oaxaca in southern Mexico. It was in demand in Europe, and by the end of the 18th century, it was second only to silver exports in terms of demand and productivity, or the value. Production remained almost entirely in Native American hands. Indians needed credit to buy nests of pregnant insects that they placed on the cacti. Also, the demands of colonialism put tremendous strain on Native American families and households and household structure, in addition to epidemics and diseases that upset traditional kinship networks. Missionaries attempted to impose the patriarchal model of the nuclear family on Native Americans. There were multiple pressures at the level of the family and the household. The Native Americans most often ignored the church's teachings on sexuality. So Native American community life continued in the face of European social pressure. There was persistence of the Native American notions of community life, which mitigated against some of the more harmful effects of Spanish patriarchalism. For example, the Mixtecs and Zapotecs continued as before the conquest to identify women as members of the community rather than just simply as the wives of specific men. When a husband became abusive of his wife, he had to answer to the entire community, which was a more effective form of social control and a more effective form of protection for women than the Spanish system. Servenaqui was a practice in Peru among the former Incan population, and they persisted in this practice of trial marriage, in which young couples lived together to test their mutual compatibility before formally marrying in the church. Those who decided not to marry went their separate ways without loss of personal honor. Children born of these unions which would be illegitimate in the eyes of the Spanish church, bore no such social stigma in Andean society. Sounds a little bit like some of today's social practices. Religion and community identity. Villages took pride in the size and beauty of their principal church building. Among the Catholic Indians, there were laymen who were known as fiscales or fiscales, and they were also lay organizations called cofradias. I'm sorry, I pronounced that wrong. Cofradias, which could be roughly translated as co-fraternities. There were often there was observance of religious holidays. Indigenous religions had nothing comparable to Christian notions of individual sin and guilt, which led to some misunderstandings and difficulties in communication. For example, the Nahuas, another name for the ethnic people formerly known as Aztecs or Mexicas that spoke Nahuatl in central Mexico, reportedly avoided the sacrament of confession. There was also a great deal of syncretism. Native Americans accepted certain elements of Christianity but retained certain of their traditional beliefs. A great example of this mixture of Catholicism and pre-Columbian native religious beliefs was the Aztec earth goddess Tonatzin, who had a shrine in Mexico City, and on that shrine was the apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and a shrine to the Virgin of Guadalupe. The dark-skinned version was built over the shrine of Tonatzin. And here's a picture of Tonatzin, the earth goddess of the Aztecs. This is a Franciscan priest, Bernabé de Sahagún, who opposed the veneration of the Virgin of Guadalupe, saying that it was not a Christian apparition but was a former Aztec deity. And there's several pictures from that time period. This is an Aztec drawing of the demands for produce made by the Spanish. This is a will and testament written in Nahuatl, the Aztec language. In the Jesuit and Franciscan missions, the site were very much present in both Mexico and Peru. The Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, attracted highly educated men from throughout Europe. They could be found among the most outspoken defenders of the Indians. You recall this probably from the film The Mission with Robert De Niro. The Franciscan missionaries, especially in Mexico, were active in areas that would eventually become part of the United States. Life within the missions was more structured for the Native Americans. The missions formed one component of a complex network of Jesuit and Franciscan enterprises. And here's a picture of a church in Arizona, I believe in Arizona or New Mexico. So the Indians in the República de Españoles, they were called Ladinos if they were fluent in Spanish. And Spanish towns and cities quickly became magnets for Indians. In Bogotá, Colombia, at the end of the 17th century, there were 10,000 Indians living with only 3,000 Hispanics. These people, the Native Americans, were able to resist in many cases. Native Americans outside of Spanish control were known as Indios Barbaros. That means they were living, the saying was in Spanish, they were living sin rey, sin fe, and sin ley, without king, without faith, and without law. An example would be the Apaches in northern Mexico. And also in southern Chile, it would be the Araucanians. And there were others who became excellent horsemen with escaped Spanish horses. Eventually, these groups were wiped out because of technical advancements such as railroads, barbed wire, repeating rifles, and the telegraph. There were regional revolts of Indians in 1680. Pope led the Pueblo people to revolt a successful revolt in New Mexico. In 1712 in Chiapas in southern Mexico, and a massive revolt in 1780 in Peru led by Tupac Amaru II, born Jose Gabriel Condorcanqui. There were a number of Native Americans that wrote histories. Generally, the losers are the people who do not write the history, but in this case there are several, including Felipe Guaman Pomo de Ayala, who wrote a monumental history of the conquest of Peru. Also, Garcilaso de la Vega. So that is chapter 5. Please read the chapter and take the quiz, and we'll continue next week. Thank you.